Hey, brothers and sisters, thank you for tuning back in. Welcome to episode number 2, where we're going to get into a little bit of my testimony. But before I share my story, I just wanted to say that if you've ever felt discarded, ashamed, or disqualified because of your past, then this episode is definitely for you. I'm not here to glorify trauma. I'm here to testify that Jesus does not only rescue, but he repurposes. And I once watched a video that said if it's covered by the blood, it's now a weapon for the gospel. So here's what I have against Satan. So before we get into this, I just wanted to say it was incredibly difficult for me to write out my entire testimony. I sat down and wrote bullet points on paper, and as I was, just talking through it, kind of freestyle talking, I noticed that I was talking for well over 30 minutes and sometimes an hour. And even when I tried to put pen to paper, it's just, there's so much. What I can tell you to begin is that the story actually starts right around the age of 8, where Jesus strangely pulled me towards the church. My family was not a part of a church. We didn't, start going at a young age. I wasn't part of like a youth ministry very young. It wasn't until like I said, turned about 8 years old that these kids down the road moved in, and their father was a pastor, and he invited us to church, or they invited me to church rather. And so I started going with them Sundays, and that's how I kind of pulled my mom into it. And I want to say we went to church until I was about maybe 12, and then I fell off. There were some things that occurred within a church, not the one we started at. We ended up going to another mega church that I will not name, but some things happened in there that ultimately pushed me away, because at a young age, I was accrediting Christian behavior to Christ himself, which I know is wrong now, but when you're so young, you don't really put those two together. So like I said, it starts way back, but for the sake of time, I'm going to try to just run through the key points here. And I even took some notes so that way I could stay on topic and not like talk your head off. So getting into it, I want to say the biggest part of my testimony started at about age 12, when I started dealing with really bad depression. My childhood was not the best. I'm not going to try to sit here and say it was the worst either. I know some people have a much worse upbringing than I did, but there were things going on both sides of my family that impacted me at a young age. There's lots of, unfortunately, drug addiction, alcoholism, and a plethora of other things that, most kids shouldn't have to deal with or see. But the depression started at about 12, and by 13, I experienced SA. I'll put the word here. I don't want to get shadow banned. Um, and that seems to be the point where everything kind of went downhill for me. I started acting out a lot. I started throwing myself around in a way that I definitely shouldn't have. And at the time, I felt like it gave me more power. I know that sounds crazy, but it was like, well, if I say so, then I'm in control. Um, and let's be honest, we also have a culture where that's condoned, not only condoned but celebrated. You think that as a child that's what love is, and it's not at all. And it actually ended up causing way more mental health issues than I was prepared to handle in adulthood. And still to this day, I'm having to process and go through those things in therapy. And I can't tell you if that's exactly what led to my attempt to unalive myself at 14. But I know there's a lot of emotional disturbances going on there. And at 14, my freshman year in high school, I had taken half of a bottle of aspirin, trying to end my own life. That event led me not only to the hospital, but to an inpatient unit, which was a whole nother experience in itself. I feel like I can make a whole podcast about my experience as an inpatient, as a minor, but I'll have to talk about that at another day so I don't go off on a side tangent. But as you can see, these things kind of started manifesting at a very young age, um, middle school, high school, all of that. And I started experimenting with drugs. It wasn't an ongoing, everyday kind of thing. It was mostly weekends and when I can get around my mom's back. I know my mom listens to this podcast, so sorry, mom. Um, but it was the sneaking around and doing the things that I knew I shouldn't be doing because they were fun. And adults always have this habit of telling you not to do things, but they don't ever tell you why and what can come of them. And so it gave me this idea that my parents around and the other adults around me were just fun suckers. They didn't want me to enjoy being young and experiencing life, and that's not the case at all. As I got older, especially being in my 30s now, I look back and I'm like, oh, that's why. So, moving forward, like I said, these things kind of started young. And then by the time I turned 18, I started working in bars and restaurants, mostly night shifts. And I thought that it was just the most fun thing in the world. I started drinking very heavily. I know that not every bar I worked in had a lot of drug usage going on, at least not that I was aware, but the alcohol itself was still just a constant thing. And it went from me having fun on weekends to now me drinking even on weekdays. And at this time I was in college, so I started falling behind. I think by the time I officially put a pause on school and joined the Navy, I'll get to that part in a second, but I had a 1.6 GPA. Yeah, so it took a lot out of me. But I can honestly say that the bartending, it it didn't stop there. I actually was money hungry. I thought in order to get places in life that success is measured by the amount of income and money you have. And being a young college student and only working in a bar, yeah, I was making good money, but there was more to be made. And so I found myself in a tiny little strip club in the small college town that I was living in. And man, that money was more than I expected. Looking back where I am now, my paychecks as an adult are more than I was making. But when you're that young, getting $300, $400, $500 in one night is like, whoa. That was a whole 2-week paycheck from when I was working retail. So I was like, man, I just made a paycheck in one day. Why would I go back? And I remember multiple people warning me and saying, like, don't get into that lifestyle, it'll suck you in, don't get in, don't do it, it's a trap, like you'll never get out. And I really do wish that I had believed them, but at the same time, if I did, I wouldn't be where I am today. So again, I'm not glorifying it, I'm just saying I'm glad it happened because I now can use these experiences to help others. But with that being said, I'm also not going to neglect talking about the severity of how difficult it is to thrive in that environment and how much it does bring you down. And I'm sure somebody might come across this channel who's still working in an adult nightclub and might completely disagree with me. And what I would tell you is, brother, sister, get out. It seems fun, and that's how it sucks you in. And by the time you realize the mess that's been created around you, it's going to be incredibly difficult to leave. So just wanted to stress the importance of staying away from these environments. Now, with that being said, in this tiny little strip club in this tiny little town in Texas, I had my first encounter with Jesus. It wasn't anything crazy or fancy like you hear in some people's testimonies. It was through a group of women who came in wearing t-shirts that said Jesus loves strippers. And I remember the first time I saw them, immediately, like, I'm thinking snarky thoughts. I'm like, what are they doing in here? Like, aren't they scared? Like, do they think we're Satan? Coming up with a bunch of different ideas of who these people were and how dare they come in here even, but they didn't come in and demean us. They didn't come in and tell us to repent. They didn't come in and make us feel bad for even being there. What they did was they would come in and bring us little gifts. And it wasn't anything forceful. It started with, hey, we made these little gift baskets for you. Here you go, blah, blah, blah. What's your name? My name's so-and-so. And for the longest time, I only gave them my dance name. I never gave them my real name. So I was like, great, these people are going to show up at my door and they're going to start getting weird. That never happened. But at one point, I did reach out to one of the women, and she took me to church with her. And she took me out to lunch, and we had a whole bunch of different conversations about Jesus and my past and my background and where my family was like, what my family was like growing up. And I felt heard for the first time. I felt seen, and it made me kind of almost in that moment think like, I wonder if I can ever do this, what she's doing one day. Uh, I guess I'll give you a sneak peek. I am, but I'll get to that in a minute. So it started there, and it didn't click right away. I still kept working in the clubs. I even eventually moved to Austin, Texas, where I worked at one main club there. I also bounced around to a few clubs in different cities for very short stints, not, staying long time, but kind of hopping around trying to see where I can get the most money. And no matter what, I always ended up right back in Austin. And I will be the first to say, as much as I love every single person that I came across in Austin, I still think about all of the people that I met, that I talked to, that I hung out with on a daily basis, and I miss them. But that place, you can get your hands on just about any drug that you can imagine. And I did. And then that's when the spiral really started. It went from, like I said, partying on the weekends to like then drinking every day to now doing drugs every single day. And it wasn't just little bits. Let's just say I was dropping a pretty hefty amount of money on things, lots of prescriptions, which is why I'll have to talk about this again in another video, but I have a lot against pharmaceuticals for this reason, for my own personal reasons. And after, the drug use kept starting, and of course there's alcohol and bad decisions and regrets. I also got this idea that I needed some kind of purpose. Like I was looking for something higher in life, something greater than me. And I found myself in a Wiccan coven. And I will say, when I first got in there, I felt like I had found my place. All of the people in the coven were so nice. They were super understanding. And I still love each and every single one of them. Again, I think about them often and pray for them often, but I had no idea what I actually walked into. I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have heard, they're called pendulums, and it's like a little crystal thing with like a point at the bottom, and you hold it on a chain and hold it over your hand and ask it to answer questions for you. And I know in the past when I had seen it, I was like, there's no way. That's so stupid. Like they're moving their finger up top or something to make it move. And so, we went into a store in Austin where they sell witchcraft type items. And I remember one of my friends was like, hey, try this one. You have to let the pendulum pick you. And so I pick one up, and she was like, ask it to show you yes and show you no. And when I said, show me yes, it started going around. And it scared me for a second. Like I pulled my hand back and I was like, what just happened? Because I did not move that. And then I was like, okay, so I did it again. And it's like, show me no. And it started swinging back and forth instead of in a circle. And so I was like, okay, so this is real. And that's the thing. Satan will always show out when you ask him, because he wants to entice you and pull you in. And unfortunately, I fell for it. So I'm telling you right now, don't fall for it. It seems great. It seems cool. It does not end up how you think it's going to, because that led me into full-fledged practicing. I was doing the candle magic, the oil magic, the crystals, you name it. And the spells came true exactly as I asked for them. However, the thing about practicing Wicca is you have to be so disgustingly specific with what you want. One of the examples that someone gave me that I look to as a mentor, and it sticks with me today. I remember he was like, if you want $10,000, you need to be specific in how you want that, because if you don't, maybe one of your family members has a life insurance policy for $10,000, and when you cast that spell, maybe that's how you get that 10,000, but you weren't fully prepared to part ways with this, relative. Like, that was just an example. That's not what happened to me, but when I heard that, I remember taking a step back and saying, like, this sounds evil. Like, what kind of trickery and foolery would one do that you're casting a spell to get these things you need, and then something tragic happens to accomplish that? In my head, I'm like, there's no way. Like, I see that these things are working, so there has to be something authentic to what I'm practicing here, but it doesn't feel right. And throughout the whole time, I just remember God, putting these questions in my head of like, if this is the real religion, why is it so expensive? Why are you dropping hundreds of dollars on crystals and oils and candles? And, if this was the real true religion, if this was the real true operating force of the universe, why would they only make it for people who can afford the things for the spells? Because then it almost felt classist at that point, and I don't know if y'all have ever been into like one of those rock stores, as some call it, but where they have like Wiccan type spell materials, rather. It's not cheap. It's actually I remember spending hundreds of dollars every time I would go in. And so for me, I'm like, again, like, if this is real, then those who are less fortunate will not have the ability to practice this. So it can't be the real one. And that's what ultimately pulled me away, was realizing that there was just too many flaws, too many errors, too many things that made me wonder, like, why does this not feel right? I see it's working. I see the spells happening in the way that I've asked, but it's not right. And as soon as I pulled away from witchcraft, the depression hit tenfold. It was depression. It was crippling anxiety. It was severe SI, to the point where I had made a plan to unalive myself multiple times. I didn't follow through, but I had even overdosed at one point during this. And I remember shortly after that, the very next day or 2 days after, I immediately went back to using. And I didn't care. I was well aware of the fact that it could have killed me. And at this point, I just didn't want to be here anymore. And God did not let that happen. Instead, he pulled me away from that lifestyle. He also showed me that what was going to happen. Unfortunately, I lost a lot of friends who I had worked with, who I had hung out with, all from things such as OD. Some were bad choices that they had made while under the influence that ultimately resulted in the end of their life. I mean, I don't want to go too into detail, but there was a point where I was like, I don't want this to happen to me. I don't want to die. Even though I had been fighting SI for so long, there was just something internally that was like, no, I don't want to die, at least not like this. And so I quit. I broke my lease on my apartment. I started working in a retail store, making some of the worst money I'd ever made in my entire life. And I hated it. And then I eventually moved back in with my mom. And when I moved back in with her, I started bartending. I thought it wasn't as bad as dancing. Mind you, I still hadn't found Jesus at this point. They were still on a slow roll. This is what I mean. He will sit with you and he will be patient with you until you figure it out. But sorry, I keep saying I'm just filler space while I breathe, I guess. But after I moved in with my mom, I started bartending at clubs again until I eventually joined the military. And it was in the military that the real spiritual stuff started actually happening. I was drinking a lot when I first got in. I couldn't get access to anything else, so I took what I could and still made poor choices. And now I have even more regrets that I have to live with and cope with. But it was once I got out of, boot camp, and we have A school and C school in the Navy. I don't know what other branches had, but once I got to the fleet, I met my husband. And that was the key turning point, because in the moment when we actually decided to get married and went to the courthouse, we were in the car driving back, and I still remember this day like so clearly. It was in the car, and I felt, when I say that God talks to me, what I mean by that, just a quick little before I continue. What I mean by that is that it's a thought that I know I wouldn't have on my own. I wouldn't have it organically. Like, that thought was placed there by God, because it's not me. I'm not thinking that way. And it was a thought of, I fulfilled my end. Now you fulfill yours. And I remember thinking, like, why do I have this thought? Like, what's going on? And then this memory came back. And it was the day that I decided to actually join the military. I was detoxing on my apartment floor in Austin, and I'm crying. Like, I was dealing with so much heartbreak from a different man that had led me on and messed with my head for years. I was wanting to end my own life. I was actually sick with the flu on top of all of those things, which is, for lack of better words, it helped the detox process because I didn't want to use when I had the flu. But it was so much going on. And I told God, if you just give me a good man to marry, I will give my life to you. It took a few years, but he held up his end. And that's exactly what that meant. And I remember it took me back for a second. And I was like, okay, if this is God, he did fulfill his end. But how do I know he's real? And from there, it started what I would say about 3 years worth of soul searching and digging. And by digging, I mean thousands of hours of YouTube Bible studies, hours upon hours upon hours of reading through the Bible and trying to understand what it meant, and asking God to show himself. And I still remember, this was, after me and my husband had been married a few years. At first, we were living in California. And so I was talking to Mormon missionaries. I had an amazing friend out there who I still talk to today. And she actually invited me to church with her. And I remember the day she invited me to church with her. No, we went on a hike. And after this hike, she was like, "Oh, I got to go to church tonight." My first instinct was to laugh at her, because I was like, "Church? Nobody goes to church. That's so dumb." And I see her face, and it's straight. She's like, "Yeah, I go to church." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And, it kind of took me a second. Like, it was almost like her, not the fact that she wasn't making a joke kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, maybe I can talk to her, and I didn't want to get weird and start talking, in the middle of this trail. So after some time, she eventually invited me to church, and she was the first one to invite me to a church after, aside from the lovely ladies that would come into the club and bring us gifts. So it had been years since I had gone into one. And I remember I didn't even feel anything the first time, but I wasn't feeling anything against it either. It was like, okay, I feel very neutral. Let me see how this goes. And then that's when I started talking to different missionaries and doing all of this research. And it ultimately left me in a position where I can see the truth in the word that I was reading. But for some reason, I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to see him. I wanted to have a conversation with Jesus. I wanted God himself to come down and talk to me. And it wasn't until after I became a believer, several years, after the fact, that I realized what was wrong with that. There's that, I don't remember where in the Bible, but it was like something along the lines of like, you were blessed because you have seen, but like blessed are those who believe but have not seen. Bear with me here. if you know what I'm talking about. But it took a while for me to realize that that was wrong, but he still showed himself to me. And the way he did that, which I don't recommend for most believers, is I became obsessed with the end times. He tapped into that like ongoing depression I had, and he showed me the blessed hope first, because he knew that things like the end of the world and apocalypses scared me. And he was like, it was almost like his way of being like, hey, I know that this is big fear for you. I'm going to show you my plan and how it's going to work out. And as I'm reading these events that are supposed to unfold, I'm also seeing Bible prophecy unfold in real time, right? So I'm not going to get into the whole end time stuff, but seeing the prophetic events occurring that fulfill exactly what the Bible said, I was like, man, you can't make this up. Like this is real. And so I started diving in, and I was like, I want more, I want more. And so still to this day, like I will spend hours watching different YouTube videos and pastors talking about different books of the Bible and what it means and the hidden meanings. And it's so fascinating to me because it's like a giant riddle. And just as soon as you think you get the gist or the synopsis of a story, you go back to like the Greek writing, and then you find out there's more hidden meaning to it. It's so cool. So that's how he pulled me in. He didn't show himself to me like I had asked. I've even yelled at him. I'm not gonna lie. There was one day I was I was driving down the road in my car, and I really wanted something from him, to hear him, to see him, to feel him. And I started like just crying, and I'm like, God, if you actually love me, you would show yourself to me right now. The reason I say that is because he gets it. Like he wasn't mad at me for saying that. And I remember I told Christians that story, and they raised an eyebrow at me and looked scared, or like, how could you talk to God? Like God knew how I was. He knew how broken I was, and he knew how much I wanted that relationship with him. So I don't think that he looked at it bad in the way some Christians will when they hear that you were asking God to reveal himself. I always see so many videos, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But I think when you do that, that just shows God that, like, yes, you might not have the wisdom from the Bible yet, but you were so badly craving that relationship with him that you're just asking for anything. And so the reason I wanted to really touch on that is because it's not, you're not going to go to hell for that. I actually think it's a beautiful thing, to beg him to come down to you, and he will, just not in the way that you want. And that's something that I've experienced time and time again, even to still today in prayers. I'll ask him to fulfill a prayer, and he won't do it in the way that I thought it was going to be done, but he'll do it in a better way. And sometimes at first I don't recognize it, and I start getting frustrated, and I try to take things into my own hands and control everything around me. Because I'm like, well, if I can control this, then I can make sure this happens. No. Um, he's shown me I'm wrong time and time again by fulfilling things in the exact perfect way that they need to be fulfilled. So um, it's it's amazing to see how patient he was with me throughout my entire journey. It's the only way I can describe it is a father's love. If there's any parents watching this, I'm sure you can imagine when your kid's going down the wrong path and they're begging you for help or begging you to get them out of the situation. Sometimes the way you do that isn't the way they want you to do that, but at least in those moments you can see like there's hope. They at least, my child at least sees that what they've done was wrong. Maybe they get in trouble at school, or God forbid, maybe they're in trouble with the law, and maybe they're like, I regret this, I'm so sorry, I never meant to, like I don't know what I was thinking. Like, you might not be able to fix the consequences, but it's beautiful to see somebody realizing the error in their ways and wanting to come back. And I think that's what God sat there through the whole time with me. And he didn't condemn me. He saw the genuine desires in my heart. So I just wanted to say that where it stands today, I've been baptized already. That happened about 3 years ago, give or take. Today, like I said, I was going to get into a little bit later. I have my own ministry where we go into different clubs here in San Antonio, deliver little gifts to women. I think I might have mentioned it in my first episode. I don't remember, but the exact same women that started watering the seed that was planted at a young age with me, I'm now out here trying to do the exact same thing that they did. because again, I was one soul. And even though they weren't an entire part of my salvation process, they did play a key role in it. And so I only felt it was right for me to also get involved in a similar way. Um, so I didn't just get saved. I got reassigned. God used every single experience that I had. God used all of my poor choices to instead turn around and go right back into the trenches that I came out of to help others. And I think that's the most amazing thing. He's so much smarter than Satan ever will be, and he somehow knows how to take all of Satan's devious little plans and turn them into good. And then what was it? I heard one time that um, when you're trained in enemy camps, that's you learn the techniques of the enemy, and it makes it easier to defeat them and go against them. And I think that's exactly what not just me but other people like me have on their side, is you know the enemy's tactics, whether that was being in a club, working the streets, selling substances, whatever you might come from, you have a different knowledge that most people who were, say born and raised in a church and never had those experiences. You have a different skill set than those people. And there's absolutely a place for you in God's kingdom, and he can and will absolutely use you for his purpose. And so I see that I've gone a little over time here, and I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, but I did write out some Bible verses that kind of came to mind while I was typing up my notes for this, right? So just give me a couple more minutes and I'll let you guys go. So and I'm just going to read what I typed out, okay? If you've listened this far, I want you to know this isn't just my story. It's a testimony of what God can do with someone the world calls socially rejectable. I was once the heartbroken, the captive, and the mourning in silence, but Isaiah 61 says he came to bind up the brokenhearted and proclaim freedom for the captives. That's exactly what he did for me. And now I get to carry that same message into the very places that I once felt trapped. I have seen darkness. I felt the weight of addiction, assault, SI, and spiritual confusion. But Ephesians 6:12 reminds us that our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against principalities of the air. And I can testify that the enemy tried to take me out, but God taught me how to fight back. Psalm 40 says, he lifted me out of the pit and put my feet upon a rock, and he hath put a new song in my mouth. That song is this podcast. That song is the ministry that I now lead. That song is the sound of chains breaking every single time I choose to speak up. Revelation 12:11 says, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. I feel like I read that wrong. Give me one more second. Okay. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. Flow. So if you're listening and you feel like your past disqualifies you, let me be living proof that it does not. Your story is a weapon, your scars are evidence, and your surrender is the beginning of something holy. Jesus didn't come for the polished, he came for the rejected. And he's still in the business of turning strip clubs into sanctuaries. So, yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. I know that this was probably kind of all over the place. I try to keep a flow to it. Definitely going to go back and rewatch it, make sure it sounds good before I publish it. But thank you for bearing with me, for tuning into my podcast, for listening to the things I have to say. And I hope to see you guys back for episode 3. I think what I might do is talk about social work through a biblical lens, because there's a lot, that when I was in school, I noticed that all these social work rules and ethics kind of went hand in hand with the Bible. And I think it'd be kind of cool to talk about that from like a helping profession perspective. But thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate every single one of you. As soon as I post this, I'm going to say a prayer for every single person that watches my video, and hope that God will reveal himself to you in the way that he's done for me. Have a great one. Thank you so much. See you next time.